The chapel doors were made of oak, heavy and unyielding, like they had been waiting for centuries to test the strength of anyone who dared to push them open. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, pouring streaks of red and gold across the aisle. For most brides, that aisle would have been a dream, the kind of walk girls grow up imagining, lace trailing behind them, flowers in hand, family beaming with pride. For me, Claire Morgan, a United States Navy officer, that aisle was a battlefield, and the man waiting at the front pew was not a source of comfort. He was my adversary. My father, Richard Morgan, wore his best suit, tailored and perfect, but the real accessory was the smirk he had carried my entire life. He wasn't there to celebrate me. He was there to measure me against the daughter he had always wanted and to silently mock the woman I had chosen to become. His eyes locked on me as I stepped inside. They didn't soften. They didn't carry pride. They carried judgment. The same judgment I had felt since childhood dinners when my words were brushed aside. The same judgment that turned every achievement into a punchline. And now that judgment was aimed directly at the 4 stars gleaming on my shoulders. To him, those stars were not a symbol of sacrifice or command. They were an insult. They were defiance carved into metal, a reminder that I had never fit into his definition of normal. He wanted a daughter in silk, delicate and compliant, not an officer in uniform who had faced war zones, given orders that carried life or death consequences, and returned stronger each time. I could see the faint curl of his smile deepen as I walked, as if he believed this day was his victory. As if he thought my choice to wear the uniform to my wedding would humiliate me in front of family and society. To him, the ceremony was a stage for ridicule, not respect. But what my father didn't know was that the stage he believed belonged to him was about to be stolen. Every step I took down that aisle carried the weight of years of silence, of being dismissed, of being told that my path was wrong. Yet beneath that weight was something else. Strength. Steady, unshakable strength I had forged in deserts and on oceans, in rooms where decisions were made and followed without hesitation. I was no longer the girl ignored at family dinners. I was an officer who had carried lives in my hands. I was a leader who had earned respect not through family ties or inherited privilege, but through sacrifice and command. And while my father saw only a costume, the truth was waiting just beyond the silence. The organ swelled, echoing against the stone walls, and the guests shifted uneasily in their seats. They didn't know what to make of me. Some whispered, others stared, but all of them felt it. The tension hanging in the air, the invisible clash between tradition and defiance, between father and daughter. My father leaned forward slightly, his expression sharp with anticipation. He thought this was his final confirmation, the day his daughter proved she would never belong in his world. But he was wrong, because on this day the definition of respect was about to be rewritten. And it would not be written by him, it would be written by me. The bridal suite was quiet, almost too quiet. A soft hum from the air vent was the only sound, and it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would decide. On the chair in front of me lay the white uniform, pressed, perfect, every crease sharp as a blade. I had worn that uniform into rooms where presidents sat across from admirals, where the lives of men hung on maps and markers. But in this moment, staring at it under the glow of a bridal mirror, it felt heavier than any battle gear I had ever carried. I should have felt joy. This was supposed to be my wedding day, a day filled with flowers, smiles, and music. Instead, it felt like one more battlefield, and my opponent wasn't across the ocean. He was just a text message away. The phone buzzed once on the vanity table. I hesitated. I already knew who it was. When I finally picked it up, the words glared back at me, sharp and merciless. Do not embarrass us by wearing that silly costume. No greeting, no well wishes, no fatherly warmth. Just a command, cold and calculated, like every other reminder he had given me through the years that I was never enough. I stared at the message, my jaw tightening, my chest rising and falling too quickly. For 20 years, I had carried his judgment like stones stacked one after another on my back. He had called my deployments distractions, my medals, trinkets, my leadership, stubbornness. Every word he spoke was meant to shrink me, to fit me into the box he had carved long before I was old enough to resist. And here it was again, written in black and white. Even today, on the day I was supposed to feel most celebrated, he found a way to remind me that in his eyes I was still a disappointment. I set the phone down, but the words clung to me, looping in my mind. Silly costume. Was this really what he thought? That the years I had spent in deserts, on ships, in command centers were nothing more than dress-up games? That the 4 stars on my shoulders were plastic decorations from a child's toy set? The sting of it went deeper than I wanted to admit. Because no matter how hard I had fought to rise above his approval, a small part of me had always hoped that one day he would see me. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. Inhale, exhale, count. Just like I had done in briefing rooms before missions. just like I had done when the radios went silent and every man under my command looked to me for answers. The steadiness I found in the field began to creep back in, but the ache was still there, the ache of being invisible to the one man who should have been proud of me. The door creaked open without a knock, and my brother Daniel strolled in as if the room belonged to him. His tie loosened, his posture relaxed, the very picture of a man who had never once been questioned in his life. Daniel, the golden child, the perfect son, the one whose stories had filled our dinner table while mine went unheard. His eyes landed on the uniform draped over the chair, and that smug grin spread across his face. Then came the laugh, sharp, cutting, the kind of laugh meant to slice skin. "Seriously, Claire," he said, shaking his head like I had just confessed to some childish mistake. "Dad's going to have a stroke. Can you not just be normal for one day?" The words hit like a familiar wound reopening. To him, the uniform was a joke, a Halloween costume I was parading around in. He didn't see the weight it carried, the lives it represented, the burden it demanded. He only saw a chance to remind me of my place, the shadow beneath his spotlight. I studied him for a moment, this brother who had never once stood in the desert waiting for orders that could change the course of a mission, who had never spent sleepless nights wondering if the people under his command would make it home. He had lived a life paved with approval, with investments from my parents, with pride that was handed to him like an inheritance. And yet he dared to laugh at me. I felt the anger rise, sharp and hot, but I swallowed it down. Shouting would change nothing. Daniel lived in a world where everything was handed to him, and I lived in one where I had to fight for every inch. His mockery was not new. It was only the latest verse in a song I had been forced to listen to all my life. His laugh lingered in the room even after he turned to leave, still chuckling at his own cruelty. The door closed and silence pressed in again, heavier than before. I looked back at the uniform. My father's text still burned in my mind. Daniel's laughter still echoed in my ears. And for a moment, I felt the weight of both pressing down on me, daring me to fold. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. A steadiness. A fire I had carried with me through deployments, through decisions no one else wanted to make. They could laugh, they could dismiss, they could call it a costume. But the truth was this: that uniform carried authority they would never understand. It carried a story written in blood, sacrifice, and command. And on this day in that chapel, they would finally see me not as their daughter, not as their sister, not as a disappointment, but as an officer of the United States Navy, whether they wanted to or not. I reached forward, ran my hand across the crisp fabric, and lifted the uniform from the chair. The weight was still there. But now, it didn't crush me, it steadied me, because this was more than cloth and metal. This was my life, my service, my truth, and no message, no laugh, no father, no brother was ever going to take that away from me. The door hadn't even clicked shut before the sound of his laughter still rang in my ears, like an echo that refused to fade. My brother Daniel, always so sure of himself, always the one who could slice me down with nothing more than a grin. His presence lingered in that room even when he was gone, as if every cruel word he had ever spoken had been etched into the walls. For as long as I could remember, Daniel had been untouchable. The golden child, the one who could do no wrong. His triumphs were celebrated like holidays, while mine were treated as inconveniences to be brushed aside. If he got a promotion, champagne flowed. If I earned a medal, it was just another little pin. That hierarchy wasn't spoken aloud, but it was carved into the bones of our family. Daniel at the center, glowing under the light of their approval. Me, always orbiting in the shadows, fighting to be seen. And today, on my wedding day, nothing had changed. His mocking laugh wasn't about the uniform alone. It was about a lifetime of being reminded that in his world I would never measure up. I sat down slowly, staring at the phone on the table, my father's text still burning in my mind. Between his words and Daniel's smirk, it felt like the two of them had built a cage around me, trying to trap me in the role they had written long ago. A role where I was invisible, where I was always less. The ache in my chest pulled me back into memories I had tried to bury. It was a Christmas dinner years ago, the kind of evening that should have been filled with warmth and laughter. Richard Morgan, my father, sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. My mother floated around, smoothing napkins and pouring wine, pretending not to notice how lopsided the balance always was. And at the center, as always, was Daniel. He leaned back in his chair that night, telling the story of his latest promotion at the firm. His voice carried across the room, laced with self-importance. Every pause was met with nods and smiles, every boast wrapped in applause from my parents. It was a performance, and they were his eager audience. I had sat quietly waiting. I had just returned from a deployment where I had led a unit through nights so tense that silence itself felt like a weapon. Only weeks earlier, I had been awarded a distinguished medal. It wasn't just medal and ribbon. It was recognition from the Navy for choices that had weighed on me like stone. Choices that had cost men their lives and saved others. Choices I still carried in my bones. When there was finally a lull in Daniel's monologue, I spoke. My voice was steady but soft, not from shame, but because I already knew how it would land. I was awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal last month. For half a second, my father looked at me, just long enough for me to think maybe this time will be different. Then he patted my arm, smiled faintly, and said the words that have never stopped echoing in my memory. Another little pin. And just like that, he turned back to Daniel, his booming laughter filling the room again as if my words had never been spoken. My accomplishment dissolved into air, swallowed by the glow they reserved for my brother. I was invisible once more, a ghost at my own family's table. That was Daniel's power, not just his success, but his ability to eclipse me entirely. His life was the standard against which mine was always diminished. He never had to raise his voice. All he had to do was laugh, and the room tilted in his favor. And he knew it. That's what stung most as he stood in my bridal suite, smirking at the uniform that had cost me more than he could ever imagine. To him, it was nothing more than a joke, another chance to play the part of the clever older brother. He didn't see the nights I spent awake in foreign deserts, the missions that had carved lines into my face, the weight of responsibility that had shaped me into who I was. He only saw an opportunity to remind me that in his eyes I was still second place. I clenched my fists on my lap, feeling the familiar fire of anger and sadness twist together. I wanted to shout at him, to make him understand that this was not a costume, not some childish rebellion. It was the sum of battles fought, of lives carried, of choices that could never be undone. But I didn't shout, I knew better. Shouting at Daniel was like throwing pebbles at a wall. It left no mark, only reminded you of how solid the wall truly was. Instead, I sat there in silence, letting the memory of his laugh harden into something sharper, something steadier. Because the truth was this: Daniel had lived a life of inherited pride. I had lived a life of earned respect. And on this day in that chapel, he was about to learn the difference. The air in the room shifted as I stood and walked to the chair where the uniform lay waiting. I ran my hand across the fabric, feeling the crisp lines, the weight of the stars on the shoulders. This wasn't just clothing, it wasn't even just a symbol. It was proof that while Daniel had been handed everything, I had built my life inch by inch, scar by scar. Daniel's laughter would fade. My father's text would be forgotten. But the respect of warriors, of men and women who had followed me into danger and trusted me with their lives, that would remain. And when those chapel doors opened, and when the world saw me walk down that aisle, Daniel's smirk would finally disappear. Because for the first time in our lives, the light would not be his. It would be mine. The memory of that Christmas dinner was a wound I carried like an old scar, healed on the surface, but tender every time I brushed against it. If you had walked into the room that night, you would have thought it was picture perfect. Candles glowing, silverware gleaming, a roast turkey at the center of the table. My mother had outdone herself, as she always did. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, the kind of scent that wrapped itself around you like a holiday card come to life. But beneath that veneer, the imbalance was the same as it had always been. Richard Morgan, my father, sat at the head of the table, posture regal, voice commanding. He didn't just host the dinner, he dominated it. Every conversation orbited around him, every word spoken a chance for him to assert his place as the center of gravity. My mother floated at his side, smoothing every sharp edge, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, filling glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. She was the diplomat, the peacemaker, the one who made dysfunction look like tradition. And at the very heart of their attention was Daniel. My brother leaned back in his chair, tie loosened, glass of wine in hand, his grin wide as he launched into yet another story about his career. That night it was his promotion, the corner office, the team he managed, the deal he had closed. His voice filled the room easily, the cadence smooth, each pause punctuated by my parents' approving nods and indulgent laughter. To them, Daniel's world was the only one that mattered. The corporate skyline, the cocktail receptions, the language of quarterly earnings, that was success in their eyes, that was worth celebrating. I sat quietly as I had done 100 times before, listening, watching, waiting for a space to open. Because while Daniel was basking in his spotlight, I was holding something close to my chest, something that mattered far more than a title or a desk with a view. Only a few weeks earlier, I had been awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. It wasn't just another ribbon for a uniform. It was recognition of choices that had cost me nights without sleep, choices that had determined whether men lived or died. It was the Navy telling me, "We see you, we trust you, we know the weight you carry." I wanted to share it, not for validation, but because part of me still hoped, foolishly, that maybe this time my parents would see me. Maybe this time they would look past Daniel long enough to recognize what I had become. So when Daniel finally paused to sip his wine, I cleared my throat softly and spoke. I was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal last month. The words hung in the air, delicate but steady, like a small flame flickering against the weight of their indifference. For a fraction of a second, my father's eyes met mine, just long enough to light a spark of hope in my chest. Then he smiled faintly, reached across to pat my arm, and said the words that would echo for years. "Another little pin." And just like that, he turned back to Daniel. The spark in my chest died as quickly as it had ignited. My medal, something that represented blood, sacrifice, command, had been reduced to a trinket no different from a novelty charm. In that moment, my accomplishment dissolved, swallowed whole by the glow they reserved for my brother. Daniel smirked, lifting his glass again as if the conversation had never even shifted. My mother smiled tightly, eyes flickering away from mine, pretending not to see the hurt written across my face. The table came alive again with Daniel's voice, my father's laughter, the sound of silverware against china. And I sat there, invisible at my own family's table. When the dinner ended, I excused myself quietly, slipping out into the cold night. My breath came in small clouds as I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel. I replayed the moment again and again, the pat on my arm, the dismissive smile, the phrase that stripped my service of meaning. Another little pin. I told myself it was careless, that maybe he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Desperate for comfort, I called my mother. Her voice was gentle, the same voice she always used when trying to smooth over the jagged edges of my father's words. "He's from another time," she said softly. "He doesn't understand the world you live in, he just wants to see you settled." Settled, the word sank like a stone in my chest. Settled meant quiet, settled meant safe, settled meant giving up the life I had chosen for one they could understand. In her voice I heard not comfort but confirmation that they would never see me. Not really. I sat in silence, the car growing colder around me, and the truth cut deeper than any dismissal ever had. My family's recognition was a door that would never open, no matter how high I climbed, no matter how many medals I earned, no matter how many lives I carried in my hands. And in that realization, something hardened in me. I would have to live without it. That night marked a turning point. I stopped chasing their approval like a child running after shadows. Instead, I began to build something stronger for myself, respect earned in the Navy, camaraderie forged in the fire of missions, a chosen family of brothers and sisters who knew exactly what the weight of command felt like. Still, every now and then the ache returned, like it did that morning in the bridal suite. The echo of being invisible, of being dismissed at the very table where I should have belonged. But as I stared at the uniform laid out before me, I knew that dinner had not diminished me. It had prepared me. Because on this day in that chapel, I would no longer be invisible. The people who had overlooked me would have no choice but to see, and when they did, the truth would break through like sunlight through stained glass, undeniable, unshakable mine. The room hummed with low static, the kind of sound that makes silence feel alive. Encrypted radios crackled, screens glowed with grainy satellite feeds, and every man in that command center waited for my word. It wasn't a wedding chapel or a dinner table where I was invisible. This was my battlefield, and here I was seen. On the largest screen, the grainy image of a building flickered, concrete walls, shattered windows, shadows moving just out of sight. Inside were hostages, innocent lives. Outside, crouched in the darkness, was a SEAL team ready to move. Their breathing came through my headset in short, steady bursts, men trained to be ghosts until the moment they struck. "Valkyrie, this is Echo Leader," the team commander's voice came through, calm but edged with tension. "We've got eyes on the hostages. Situation unstable. Request permission for last resort maneuver." Every set of eyes in that room turned to me. Hardened captains, seasoned officers, men who had spent decades in combat, now waited in silence. Not one of them questioned my authority. Not one of them smirked at my stars or reduced my command to a costume. The weight in that moment pressed down hard, but it didn't crush me. It steadied me, because this was where my voice mattered most. I scanned the feeds again. Every second counted. Too long and the hostages would be lost. Too fast and the entire team could be wiped out. My pulse pounded, but my voice stayed even, steady like stone. "Execute Alpha," I said. "Send the sitrep when you are clear." The reply was immediate. "Roger that, Valkyrie." That word Valkyrie carried through the room like a seal of authority. It wasn't a nickname given out of amusement. It was respect earned in silence, through choices made when no one else wanted the burden. Valkyrie, the one who carries the fallen, the one who decides. The seconds that followed stretched like hours. The static of the radios hissed in my ears. Then the comms came alive. Hostages secured, building clear, Team Exfil in progress. Relief swept through the room, but it wasn't noisy. No one cheered, no one clapped. Instead, there was a collective exhale, the kind that comes when lives are saved because the right call was made. Heads turned to me with a quiet nod of respect, a recognition that didn't need words. In that moment, I thought of my father's text, "Silly costume." I thought of Daniel's laughter, "Can't you just be normal?" Their voices had followed me like ghosts, always trying to shrink me back into something small, something safe. But in this room, those voices had no power. Here, respect wasn't inherited. It wasn't bought with money or polished with appearances. It was earned, and I had earned it. Hours later, when the operation was over and the adrenaline had begun to ebb, I found myself alone in the command center. The screens were dark, the radios silent. I sat at the head of the long table, staring at the empty chairs. This was my world. Not the one where Daniel's voice drowned out my own, not the one where my father's smirk cut me down before I could stand tall. Here, the weight I carried was acknowledged. Here, every decision, every scar, every sleepless night meant something. I leaned back, letting the quiet wash over me. And in that silence, I realized something I had always known but never spoken aloud. My family's approval was irrelevant. I didn't need their validation because I had built my own legacy, one they could never understand, one they could never take away. Still, the ache was there. Because even knowing all of that, I couldn't erase the sting of being unseen by the people who were supposed to love me first. That ache was why my father's text had cut so deep, why Daniel's mockery had reopened wounds I thought had scarred over. But if my family respected only power they could not deny, then that was exactly what they would see on my wedding day. The chapel would not be a stage for ridicule, it would be a demonstration. A reminder that the silly costume my father despised was the same uniform that commanded respect from warriors, senators, and admirals alike. I had been Valkyrie in war. On that day, I would be Valkyrie in peace. And they would finally have to see me, not as a daughter to dismiss, not as a sister to mock, but as the officer I had fought to become. That night before the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror one last time. My reflection stared back at me, tired eyes, sharp jawline, the faint lines of years lived under pressure. The uniform was pressed, the stars gleamed, and for the first time all day I felt calm. Because tomorrow the weight would shift. Tomorrow the battlefield would not be in a desert or in a command center. It would be in a chapel, beneath stained glass and oak doors. And tomorrow I would not fight for approval. I would stand in the truth I had built. And when the words Admiral on deck rang out, when a sea of uniforms rose to salute, my family would know this was no costume. This was no phase. This was me. The night before the ceremony, I sat in my quarters with the uniform laid out before me. The chapel rehearsal had ended hours ago, the florists had packed up their bouquets, and the wedding planner had left with her clipboard full of details that barely mattered to me. The truth was, I wasn't thinking about lace or music or which flowers lined the aisle. I was thinking about strategy. Because this wedding wasn't just a wedding. It was a battlefield. And if my family insisted on turning it into a spectacle, then I would control the stage. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the crisp white fabric with its gleaming stars. My father's words still rang in my mind, silly costume. Daniel's laughter still echoed, smug and cutting. But I had carried heavier words into combat zones, and I knew how to turn them into fuel. If they wanted to see a costume, then I would show them a uniform. Not as rebellion, not as defiance, but as proof unshakable, undeniable of what I had built. The plan began to form with methodical precision, the same way I had planned operations overseas. I pictured the chapel as if it were a command center, every row of pews a formation to be ordered, every guest a piece on the board. The ushers would not be hired hands in tuxedos. They would be officers, men and women who had served beside me, who understood discipline down to the angle of a salute. They would seat my fellow commanders and SEAL in the front rows, exactly as protocol dictated, their uniforms immaculate and aligned. No one would mistake them for decoration. They would be my honor guard. The ceremony itself would not be presided over by a priest chosen for his flowery words. It would be officiated by the Fleet Admiral of the United States Navy, in full dress uniform. His very presence would legitimize every choice I made, every star on my shoulders. When he stood at the altar, the chapel would no longer be just a place of vows. It would be a place of command. And then came the moment I knew would change everything. The doors would open, sunlight flooding the aisle, and I would walk in not in silk or lace but in my service dress whites. The organ would swell, and whispers would ripple through the civilian guests as they shifted uneasily in their suits and gowns. They would feel it, even if they couldn't name it, the air turning heavy, charged with a respect they didn't yet understand. And then, at the right moment, the command would crack through the silence like thunder. Admiral on deck. 150 officers and SEAL would rise in perfect unison, the sound of boots against stone rolling through the chapel like a storm. Hands would snap into salutes, sharp and undeniable. Civilians would gasp, whispers silenced in an instant. And in that moment, no smirk, no laugh, no dismissive phrase could erase the truth of who I was. It would not be applause. It would be recognition. I scribbled notes late into the night, each detail falling into place with the same precision I brought to the field. The seating chart was no longer a question of etiquette, it was formation. The timing of the music was not about beauty, it was about control. Even the placement of my officers in the procession had purpose. Piece by piece, I turned the ceremony into a lesson. They thought they were attending a wedding. They were about to witness a demonstration. As dawn broke, I walked through the empty chapel alone. The stained glass windows bled colors onto the stone floor, and the heavy oak doors loomed at the back, waiting. I imagined my father sitting there in the front pew, smug as ever, waiting for me to humiliate myself. I imagined Daniel's smirk, the curl of his lip as he whispered to anyone who would listen. But I also imagined the moment their expressions would shift, the disbelief, the confusion, the anger, and finally the fear. Because in this place their authority meant nothing. My father's wealth, Daniel's arrogance, none of it could command a salute, only respect could. I walked the length of the aisle slowly, each step deliberate, rehearsing not just the walk but the weight of it. This was not a march toward approval. This was a march toward truth. Every stride would carry the years of silence, the nights of sacrifice, the scars hidden beneath pressed fabric. And when I reached the altar, it would no longer be as the daughter who was never enough. It would be as the Admiral who had already proven herself in ways they could never comprehend. That night, back in my suite, I stood in front of the mirror with the uniform in my hands. I thought about my mother, who would wring her hands and whisper excuses for my father. I thought about my brother, who would laugh until the moment his arrogance shattered. And I thought about my father, who would watch his power crumble in silence. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about clarity, about forcing them to see what they had spent years ignoring. I slipped the uniform onto its hanger, smoothing the fabric one last time before I turned off the light. Tomorrow, the chapel would not belong to Richard Morgan. It would not belong to Daniel. It would belong to me. The chapel was hushed, every whisper swallowed by the vaulted ceiling above. Candlelight flickered against stained glass, throwing shards of color across polished stone. Civilians shifted in their seats, adjusting silk dresses and tailored suits, fanning themselves with programs as if they were waiting for nothing more than a quaint ceremony. They had no idea what was coming. The organist pressed a low chord, the sound lingering in the air like a warning bell. And then it happened. The sharp strike of boots against stone. The sound cut through the stillness, deliberate and echoing, each step measured with military precision. The guests turned as two Navy SEAL entered from the side doors, their service dress uniforms immaculate, their eyes fixed forward. Shoulders squared, chins raised, movements in perfect synchronization. They looked less like men and more like statues carved of steel, set into motion by duty itself. Their presence shifted the air instantly. Civilians, adorned in glittering jewelry and perfumed colognes, sat rigid, suddenly unsure of themselves. What had moments ago felt like a social gathering now felt more like a tribunal. The SEAL marched to the front of the chapel, boots striking the stone in rhythm, until they reached their positions flanking the altar. They turned sharply, heels clicking, and stood at attention, silent sentinels guarding the sacred space where vows would soon be spoken. No one had told the guests to rise, but the sheer weight of discipline made them sit taller, quieter, as if instinct alone warned them not to disturb the order that had entered the room. In the front pew, I could already see the cracks forming. My mother's eyes darted nervously, her hands smoothing her skirt as though that would somehow erase the discomfort. Daniel leaned forward, whispering to my father with a grin he thought was clever, but now seemed uncertain. And my father, Richard Morgan, sat with his jaw set, his smirk faltering as he realized the stage was not his to command. He had come expecting a spectacle he could control, a scene where he would sneer at his daughter for choosing uniform over silk. But now the air in the chapel had shifted, and he wasn't the one holding the audience's attention. The sound of those boots had done what years of my words could not. They had silenced him. I watched from the doorway at the back. Unseen for now, my breath steady, every detail I had planned was falling into place. The guests thought this was a wedding. What they were about to witness was a demonstration, a lesson in respect written not with speeches but with presence. The organ swelled again, notes rolling like waves, filling the chapel until the stone walls seemed to vibrate. The civilians exchanged glances, their earlier chatter gone, replaced by uncertainty. They had dressed for champagne toasts and polite applause. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by a sea of white and gold. Officers and commanders seated in formation, posture perfect, eyes forward. It wasn't chaos, it was order. A discipline so sharp it cut the very air. I thought of my father's message again, silly costume. I thought of Daniel's laughter, dismissing the uniform as nothing more than a Halloween disguise. Did they still believe it now, watching as the Navy itself filled the room with reverence? Could they still cling to the illusion that my life's work was a phase, that my stars were trinkets? The chapel was no longer theirs to define. It was mine. The SEAL remained motionless at the altar, silent guardians, their presence commanding without a word. Behind them, rows of officers filled the pews, their medals glinting under candlelight. Senators and commanders shifted uncomfortably, their political power paling against the quiet authority of military discipline. And still, I waited at the doors. Because the moment hadn't arrived yet. The boots had set the stage. The discipline had silenced the doubts, but the crescendo was still to come. My entrance would not be the soft glide of a bride in lace. It would be the steady stride of an admiral, walking not toward validation but toward truth. When the heavy oak doors swung open and sunlight spilled across the aisle, it would be too late for my father to sneer, too late for my brother to laugh. The moment they thought belonged to them would be stolen forever. The organ swelled louder, echoing like a storm rolling in from the sea. Guests craned their necks, whispers rippling through the pews, their unease growing with each note. The atmosphere had changed. They knew it. They felt it. This was no longer a wedding they understood. It was a ceremony they could never forget. The chapel doors groaned as they swung open, their weight echoing through the stone walls like the start of a trial. Sunlight spilled in, flooding the aisle with gold. For a heartbeat, the world held still, every head turned, every breath caught as I stepped into the light. I wasn't wearing lace. I wasn't draped in silk. I was wearing the uniform I had bled for, fought for, earned through decades of service. The service dress whites of a United States Navy admiral. The fabric caught the sunlight, crisp and blinding, and the 4 stars on my shoulders gleamed like sharp points of truth. Gasps rippled through the pews. Civilians who had expected a delicate bride instead found themselves staring at a commander. Their jeweled necklaces and polished cufflinks suddenly looked out of place against the sea of medals and ribbons that filled the front rows. The whispers began immediately, soft but sharp, carried on nervous breaths. And then I saw him. Richard Morgan, my father. He sat in the front pew, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, watching me as if every step I took was a personal insult carved into stone. Daniel leaned close, his smirk curling with cruelty, and I caught the whisper that was meant to cut me down, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She looks ridiculous." The words floated in the air, small and sharp, designed to pierce. A phrase meant to reduce me to nothing more than a stubborn child playing dress-up. But I did not falter. My steps remained steady, heels striking the stone with measured rhythm. Each stride carried the weight of every deployment, every night without sleep, every decision that had carved scars into my soul. My uniform wasn't a costume. It was armor stitched together with sacrifice. The organ swelled above me, a thunderous sound that filled the vaulted ceiling. The guests shifted, caught between discomfort and awe. Some civilians shook their heads, unsure of what to make of the scene. Others sat frozen, their eyes wide, drawn not to the flowers or the stained glass, but to the gleam of 4 stars that no whisper could diminish. I focused on the altar, on the fleet admiral standing tall in full dress uniform, his very presence legitimizing every choice I had made. He was not here out of obligation or family duty. He was here because he recognized me, respected me, and stood beside me. As I walked, memories flickered through my mind like ghosts rising from the past. My father's dismissive pat at Christmas dinner. Another little pin. Daniel's cruel laugh in the bridal suite. "Can you not just be normal for one day?" My mother's gentle excuses. "He's from another time, he just wants to see you settled." Every word they had ever used to shrink me now echoed in the space they could no longer control. And yet beneath the sting there was something else, calm. Because this time they could not laugh me out of existence. They could not smirk away the truth. The respect filling that chapel was not conditional, not hollow. It was earned, and it was undeniable. Halfway down the aisle I caught sight of my mother. Her hand covered her mouth, her eyes wide, face pale with shock. Daniel's grin faltered, confusion replacing arrogance as he looked around at the sea of uniforms sitting in disciplined silence. And my father, his smirk hardened, then wavered, as if he felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. He had come believing this day would prove me wrong, but each step I took was proof of the opposite. The aisle stretched before me, long and heavy with anticipation. Civilians leaned forward, whispering frantically. Officers sat still, eyes fixed, posture perfect. The fleet admiral gave a barely perceptible nod as I drew closer, the kind of nod reserved for equals, not subordinates. And still, the whisper echoed in my head, "She looks ridiculous." But as my heels struck the stone, I let the words dissolve. Because what my father saw as ridiculous was about to be rewritten before his very eyes. This was not his stage, it was mine. I reached the halfway point of the aisle, the organ's crescendo shaking the very walls. The seal at the altar remained statues, their presence anchoring the moment in discipline. The air was thick with tension, the silence of uniformed men and women more powerful than any applause. The civilians still didn't understand what they were witnessing. They thought this was just a wedding with an odd twist, a bride too stubborn to conform. But the moment of revelation was seconds away. I took another step, shoulders square, stars gleaming. My father's eyes burned into me, his smirk curling with contempt. And then, like a fuse reaching the charge, the command cracked through the chapel, sharp and thunderous. "Admiral on deck." The words shattered the silence, their authority undeniable. and in the same breath, 150 SEAL and officers rose to their feet. The sound of boots hitting stone rolled like thunder. Hundreds of hands snapped into salute, a crisp, unified wave of discipline and respect that shook the very air. Gasps erupted from the civilians. The whispers died instantly, swallowed by the sound of authority. Senators and commanders stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on me with reverence that had nothing to do with bloodlines or family ties. The first time my father's smirk collapsed, disbelief flashing across his face as the truth bore down on him. This was not ridiculous. This was command. This was respect. This was me. The words cracked against the chapel walls like thunder. Admiral on deck. In an instant, 150 officers and SEALs surged to their feet. The sound of boots striking stone rolled through the air, sharp and unified, a wave of discipline that shook the silence to pieces. Hands snapped to brows in a crisp salute, hundreds moving as one. The echo of it filled every corner of the chapel, more powerful than any hymn, more final than any sermon. Civilians gasped. A ripple of shock moved through the pews as jeweled necklaces clinked against bare chests and silk gowns rustled in nervous movements. Whispered judgments died on tongues. In that single motion, swift, unyielding, undeniable, the atmosphere had transformed. This was no longer a wedding. This was a recognition ceremony. I kept walking, the sunlight catching on the stars at my shoulders, the salutes reflecting back the years of sacrifice and command. My pulse was steady. My steps did not falter. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the sting of invisibility. I felt the weight of respect pressing in on all sides, not crushing but lifting. Every officer in that room had seen me in action. They had trusted my decisions when hesitation could have cost lives. They knew me not as someone's daughter, not as someone's sister, but as Valkyrie. And their salute was not tradition, it was allegiance. I looked past the forest of salutes toward the front pew. My mother's hand covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Her face had gone pale, the flush of pride she reserved for Daniel nowhere to be found. She had smoothed over my father's words for years, told me he was from another time, but now even she could not deny what those salutes meant. Daniel's jaw hung slack, his grin extinguished. The smirk that had so often drowned me out at the dinner table had evaporated, replaced by confusion that made him look small for the first time in his life. His polished confidence, so effortless in boardrooms and family gatherings, had no weight here, and my father, Richard Morgan. His smirk collapsed completely. First disbelief, then anger, then something else crept into his expression, fear. Hollow, rattling fear. The kind of fear a man feels when he realizes the power he held was only an illusion, and the daughter he dismissed now commanded the respect of warriors he could never understand. The chapel's light caught the lines in his face, the cracks in his certainty. For the first time I saw him stripped bare, no longer the unshakable patriarch, but a man trembling in the shadow of truth. I reached the front of the aisle, turned to face the altar, and the salutes held firm. It wasn't applause, it wasn't cheer, it was something stronger. It was acknowledgement that could not be undone. The fleet admiral gave me a subtle nod, then lowered his hand in return salute, his voice carrying softly but firmly across the chapel. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of an admiral of the United States Navy, remember it well. His words were not just for the officers who already knew. They were for the civilians, for the senators, for my family sitting frozen in their pew. His words drove the truth like a nail into stone. I glanced sideways just once, letting my eyes meet my father's. He tried to hold my gaze, but his jaw twitched, his eyes flickered away. For the first time, he could not look at me and dismiss what he saw. This was not a costume. This was not a phase. This was the culmination of every sacrifice he had ignored, every deployment he had minimized, every medal he had brushed aside. The 4 stars on my shoulders carried more weight than all his wealth, all his posturing, all his polished authority at family tables. And for once he knew it. The officers lowered their salutes in unison, the sound of hands falling back to sides like a wave pulling out to sea. The chapel exhaled, civilians shifting in stunned silence, their eyes darting between me and the rows of uniforms that filled the room. My mother blinked rapidly, as if hoping the image would dissolve if she looked away long enough. Daniel stared down at the floor, his arrogance swallowed by a confusion that left him speechless. And my father sat still, pale, trembling, undone. I turned my eyes forward, not sparing them another glance. This moment was not for them, it was for me. For the years of silence, the years of dismissal, the years of being made small. It was the moment when the daughter they had belittled disappeared, and the admiral they could not deny stood in her place. The organ swelled once more, this time not as background music, but as a chorus to what had already been written in the air. Guests shifted again, not out of impatience, but out of awe. They had witnessed something they didn't understand, but they felt its weight all the same. And at the altar, beneath the gaze of a fleet admiral and a sea of salutes, I felt something settle inside me. Peace. Not because my family finally saw me, but because they no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth that filled that chapel, the respect that had risen like thunder, and the unshakable certainty that I had built a life defined not by their approval, but by my own command. The echo of the salute still clung to the chapel walls, like thunder refusing to fade. For a moment, time itself seemed to stall, the civilians frozen in disbelief, the officers locked in statuesque discipline, and me standing at the altar, shoulders squared beneath the weight of 4 stars that glowed like fire in the sunlight. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the front pew. My mother sat stiff, her hand pressed against her lips as if she could hold the shock inside her mouth. Her eyes darted, searching for something to cling to, an excuse, a way to soften what she saw. But there was no smoothing this over, no gentle explanation that could reduce the gravity of 150 salutes. For once her diplomacy failed her. Daniel stared down at the floor. His polished arrogance, the grin he had carried into every family dinner, had evaporated. He wasn't laughing now. He wasn't mocking. He looked like a man who had just been told the story of his life had been a lie, and that the stage he thought was his had been stripped away forever. And then there was my father, Richard Morgan. The man who had always held the room, who had always believed his word was final, his approval the only currency that mattered. The man who had built his authority on wealth, on appearances, on the fear he instilled in those closest to him. His face was ashen. His jaw twitched, lips pressed thin, the smugness gone. I watched his eyes shift from the rows of uniforms to the gleam of medals to the Admiral standing tall at the altar and then back to me. For the first time, he couldn't dismiss me. He couldn't reduce me to a stubborn daughter in a silly costume. The truth was carved into every salute, into every officer who stood shoulder to shoulder in reverence. And he knew it. The organ's final chord lingered in the air as I reached the altar and turned to face the fleet admiral. His presence alone was enough to silence doubt, but when his voice carried across the chapel, it hammered the truth into stone. Today, he said, his tone crisp, we honor not only a union but a life defined by service, sacrifice, and command. Admiral Morgan stands here not simply as a bride, but as a leader recognized by her peers and her nation. Respect her. As we do, every syllable landed with weight. Civilians shifted uncomfortably, their jewelry and gowns feeling suddenly hollow, fragile against the quiet power in his words. Senators lowered their eyes, businessmen cleared their throats, guests who had once expected a social spectacle now found themselves caught in a moment of history. And in the front pew, my father's mask shattered piece by piece. His disbelief had curdled into anger, but even that was powerless here. Anger could not command a salute. Wealth could not summon discipline. Smugness could not erase 4 stars gleaming beneath sunlight. What I saw in his eyes was something far deeper. Fear. Not fear of me as his daughter, but fear of what he could never control. Respect freely given, authority earned, a legacy that belonged entirely to me. I held his gaze just long enough to let the silence cut. And then, with deliberate calm, I turned away, because this moment wasn't his. It was mine. The ceremony continued, but it no longer felt like a wedding in the traditional sense. Every vow spoken was layered with something larger, a declaration that my life would never again be measured by the shallow scale of my father's approval. The fleet admiral's voice wove through the chapel like command itself, his presence legitimizing every step, every choice that had led me here. When the rings were exchanged, the applause from civilians was polite, tentative. But the salute from my officers, silent and sharp, carried more weight than any cheer could. In that space, I was no longer invisible. I was undeniable. The reception hall glowed with soft light later that evening. Portraits of admirals lined the walls, glass cases displayed relics of naval history. Laughter and conversation flowed, but not the hollow kind I had grown up with. Here, every word was weighted with meaning, stories of missions carried out in silence, sacrifices remembered, respect woven into camaraderie. I moved through the room with ease, shaking hands with senators who spoke of policy, commanders who spoke of leadership, SEAL who spoke of loyalty. Each interaction reminded me that this was my world, a world I had carved out of steel and grit, a world where respect was not granted by blood but earned through sacrifice. Across the room I saw them, my family huddled in the corner like strangers at their own daughter's wedding. My mother clutched her glass, her eyes searching for words she couldn't find. Daniel sat stiff, shoulders hunched, his usual spark of superiority extinguished. And my father, he was silent. The man who had always dominated rooms with his voice now looked small, diminished, irrelevant. No one approached them, not out of cruelty, but because they did not belong. Their expensive suits and polished smiles carried no weight here. They were ghosts in a hall alive with honor. I didn't go to them. I didn't ache for their company. Their absence from my side did not leave a void. It left clarity. Because in that hall, I wasn't the daughter who had been mocked, ignored, or dismissed. I was the Admiral who had been saluted. And Richard Morgan, once so sure of his power, sat undone, stripped bare by the simple truth that his daughter had built a legacy he could neither deny nor diminish. The reception hall glowed with a light that seemed to belong to another world. Crystal chandeliers reflected off portraits of admirals who had come before me, their stern eyes watching from gilded frames. Glass cases displayed relics from battles past, swords, medals, flags carried into the fire of history. The air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the sound of glasses clinking, not with hollow cheer, but with the weight of shared sacrifice. I stood near the center of it all, no longer the invisible daughter at the dinner table. Senators and commanders surrounded me, their words not just polite small talk but genuine acknowledgement. They asked about operations, about decisions made in silence, about the burden of command. My officers in SEAL drifted in and out, each salute crisp, each handshake firm, each smile born not of obligation but of respect. This was my world. Every exchange reminded me of the life I had built. Not handed down, not softened by excuses, not measured against anyone else's standard. A life forged in choices that weighed heavier than gold or stock portfolios. A life that carried meaning. Across the room I caught sight of them. My family. They sat together at a table near the corner, polished suits and jeweled accessories suddenly muted under the weight of uniforms and medals that filled the hall. My mother clutched her glass too tightly, her knuckles white. Her smile was brittle, the kind of smile she had used all my life to smooth over sharp edges, but tonight it fooled no one. Daniel looked lost. The spark of superiority, the effortless arrogance that had once filled every dinner table was gone. He stared down at his plate as if searching for answers that weren't there, his laughter silenced in a room where his voice carried no weight. And my father, Richard Morgan. He sat stiff, his jaw clenched, his eyes hollow. The man who had always commanded attention with a smirk or a booming voice now seemed small, diminished. His presence, once so overwhelming in family gatherings, was nothing here. No one sought him out. No one deferred to him. He was just another man in an expensive suit, stripped of authority in a hall where authority meant service, sacrifice, and respect. No one approached their table, not out of cruelty, but because they simply did not belong. The conversation and laughter flowed around them like water around a stone. Officers who had faced death together had no interest in hollow pleasantries. Senators and commanders who understood the weight of command saw no reason to flatter a man whose authority existed only in his own household. My family sat in isolation, ghosts at an event alive with honor. For the first time in my life, I felt no ache at their absence. I didn't look over my shoulder, waiting for their nod of approval. I didn't measure myself against their silence. Because here I was surrounded by a different kind of family, one forged not by blood, but by loyalty, respect, and trust. As the evening carried on, speeches were made. My husband Ryan spoke briefly, his words steady, grounded, a reflection of the man who had walked his own path of sacrifice. The fleet admiral raised a toast, his glass lifted high. To Admiral Claire Morgan, he said, his voice ringing clear, for a career built not on privilege but on perseverance. For the lives she has carried, the respect she has earned, and the future she commands. The hall erupted not with raucous cheers but with the firm, unified strike of hands against glass, the sound of men and women saluting not just with arms but with hearts. I lifted my own glass not toward the corner where my family sat but toward the circle of brothers and sisters who had chosen to stand with me. Out of the corner of my eye I saw movement, my family rising quietly from their table. No announcements, no farewells, no congratulations. They slipped out through a side door, their exit unnoticed by most, unmarked by ceremony. The silence of their departure was louder than any words they could have spoken, and I did not follow. I did not ache for them to stay, because their leaving did not leave a void, it left confirmation. Blood may bind, but respect endures. Later, when the hall began to empty and the night settled into quiet, I stood near one of the portraits lining the wall. An admiral from another era stared back at me, his uniform adorned with stars that gleamed even in paint. I thought of the path I had taken to stand here, of the sacrifices, of the moments when I had nearly broken under the weight. And I thought of my father, undone in a pew, silent in a hall, slipping away into irrelevance. I realized then that I no longer needed to prove anything to him, or to Daniel, or to anyone who could not see me, because I had already been seen, by those who mattered, by those who chose to stand. That night, as I left the hall hand in hand with Ryan, the city lights of Washington spread out before us, glittering against the dark. My family had disappeared into silence, but I carried something far greater, a legacy built not from their approval but from my own resolve. And for the first time, I felt entirely whole. Years later, I stood in my office overlooking Washington. The city stretched out beneath me, a web of lights against the dark, the monuments gleaming like sentinels of history. From here, the streets looked orderly, purposeful, much like the life I had built. On my desk lay reports, briefings, and memos stamped with seals that carried weight across oceans. Every document was a reminder of the responsibility I bore, the choices I had made, the trust that had been placed in me. My career had carried me further than I once believed possible, and with each step I had earned not just rank but something far more valuable, respect. I turned from the window and let my eyes fall on a framed photograph. It wasn't of medals or ships or ceremonies. It was of Ryan, my husband, his hand resting gently on mine as we stood on a windswept pier years ago. He was a fellow officer, a man who had carried his own burdens, who never needed me to explain mine. With him, love was never conditional. It wasn't measured in approval or appearances. It was built on understanding, the kind that comes only from standing shoulder to shoulder in the fire and choosing each other anyway. That was the foundation of the life we built together. Not one of performance, but of partnership. When I thought of family now, I didn't think of the house I grew up in, of the dinner tables where my words dissolved into silence, or of the corner where my parents and brother had sat, out of place in the reception hall. Family, I learned, was not defined by blood. Family was the circle of people who chose to respect you, to stand with you, to carry burdens beside you even when they didn't have to. It was the brothers in arms who rose to their feet in a chapel, saluting not a daughter in a dress but an admiral in uniform. It was the sisters who shared cramped bunks on deployments, whispering jokes in the dark to survive another night. It was Ryan, steady and unshaken, who saw me not as someone to settle but as someone to stand with. That was my family. Sometimes I thought back to that day in the chapel, to the heavy oak doors swinging open, to the sun spilling across the aisle, to the sharp voice calling out, "Admiral on deck." I remembered the sound of hundreds of boots striking stone, the thunder of salutes snapping into place, the gasps of civilians silenced in awe. But what I remembered most wasn't the spectacle. It was the stillness in my chest as I realized I no longer needed their approval. Not my father's, not Daniel's, not anyone's who refused to see me. Because respect had already been written into my life, in the trust of those who had followed me, in the lives we had saved, in the legacy we had built together. My father faded into the background after that day. So did my mother and Daniel. They slipped quietly out of my life, their absence leaving no void. At first, I wondered if I would mourn it. But years passed and I realized the truth. I didn't need to. Their silence was not a loss, it was freedom. Legacy is not what someone hands down to you. It is what you fight for, what you sacrifice for, what you earn when others stand and recognize your worth. And my legacy was not written in their judgment. It was written in every salute, every mission, every choice made when the cost was too high and the burden too heavy. And yet, I carried it anyway. As the years stretched forward, I built a circle that was stronger than blood. Officers who became siblings. Friends who became anchors. A husband who became a partner in every sense of the word. Together, we created a life steadier than anything my father's wealth or my brother's arrogance could have provided. When I thought about family, I thought about them. And when I thought about love, I thought about the kind that endures when everything else falls away, the kind built on loyalty, respect, and trust. So if you are listening now and you've ever felt invisible in the places you should have been seen, if you've ever carried the weight of dismissal from those who should have lifted you, know this: you are not alone. Family is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes family is the one you build for yourself, the one that chooses you, the one that stands beside you when others turn away. That is where respect lives, that is where love endures, and that is where legacy is born. Family is who stands with you, not who turns away. For more powerful stories like this, subscribe now, share with friends, and tap the bell icon to stay updated with every new video.